5 minutes is not a long time. In the context of a career that will eventually span decades, 5 minutes is nothing. A rounding error. A pause between obligations. A duration so brief that the ordinary instruments used to measure professional significance would not register it at all. But there is a kind of 5 minutes that operates outside those ordinary instruments. The 5 minutes that arrives at the specific moment when a person is between what they have been and what they are about to become. When the room shifts and someone who has already made the crossing is standing near you and, for reasons that have more to do with the particular alchemy of the moment than with any formal arrangement, begins to speak about what the crossing requires. Eddie Murphy was at an industry event in the mid-2000s. This is not a remarkable fact in itself. Eddie Murphy was at many industry events in the mid-2000s, as people of his standing always are, present in the rooms where the industry gathers, because being present in those rooms is part of what the industry requires of the people whose careers have reached a certain scale. He moved through those rooms with the specific quality that belongs to people who have been in them long enough that the rooms no longer change them, who are in the room but are not performed by the room in the way that people still building their standing sometimes are. Katt Williams was in that room too, at a moment in his career when the acceleration was already underway, when the specials were in circulation, when the name was appearing on marquees, when the work done in smaller rooms for years was beginning to translate into the visibility that the larger culture eventually assigns to voices that have earned it. Katt Williams was in a room with Eddie Murphy. And Eddie Murphy, for reasons that nobody present has been entirely able to account for, stopped and spoke to him for 5 minutes. The 5 minutes that Eddie Murphy gave Katt Williams at that industry event were not a lesson. This is important to say, because the word lesson carries implications that would make what happened smaller than it was. A lesson has a teacher and a student and a subject and a method. What happened in those 5 minutes was more like one person who has been somewhere handing another person something. Not a map, not instructions, not a corrective for errors that the person in front of them has made, but something more foundational than any of those things. What Eddie Murphy spoke about, in the accounts that have come from the people adjacent to the exchange, the way that industry events always produce adjacent witnesses who carry fragments of the moments they were near, was not technique, not craft in the technical sense of the word. What he spoke about was the relationship between a comedian and the audience at the level that precedes technique, the foundation that technique is built on top of, but that cannot be produced by technique alone. He spoke about the room, about what the room gives back to a performer who is fully present in it, and what it withholds from one who is performing the idea of being present rather than actually being present. About the difference, invisible from the outside, unmistakable from the inside, between a set that is being navigated and a set that is being inhabited, between a comedian who is executing material and one who is discovering it in real time in front of the room, even when the material has been performed hundreds of times and the discovery is, in some technical sense, reconstructed rather than original. That distinction between executing and inhabiting, between performing a set and discovering it, is the distinction that separates good comedy from the kind of comedy that an audience remembers for the rest of their lives. It is the distinction that Eddie Murphy's early career had demonstrated, as well as any comedian's career had ever demonstrated it. And it was the distinction he chose, in those 5 minutes, to name for the person standing in front of him. To understand the weight of what Eddie Murphy said, it helps to understand what Eddie Murphy represented, not in the abstract sense of celebrity or cultural significance, but in the specific sense of what his career had demonstrated about the form that both men worked in and the path that the form could produce. Eddie Murphy had come to stand-up comedy and immediately done something with it that the form had not seen in quite that configuration before. The scale, the specificity of the voice, the range of character, the specific quality of physical intelligence that made his performance something the body responded to before the mind had processed what it was responding to. Delirious and Raw were not simply successful specials. They were recordings that changed what people understood stand-up to be capable of producing, the breadth of what a single comedian in a room could do with the attention of an audience that was fully given over to the experience. By the mid-2000s, Eddie Murphy's relationship to stand-up was historical rather than current. He had moved into film in the way that the largest stand-up careers of that era tended to move, because film offered resources and reach that the stand-up circuit could not. But the stand-up was still the origin point, the foundation that everything else had been built on top of. The thing that had shown, in its specific and unrepeatable configuration, what the form could do when someone brought everything they had to it. When someone with that specific history speaks to a comedian who is in the middle of doing what that history was made of, the words carry a weight that the same words would not carry from a different speaker. Not because the words are different, because the speaker has been somewhere that the listener is still on the way to, and knows from the inside what the journey requires in ways that can only be known from the inside. The 5 minutes ended. The industry event continued around both men, and the obligations that events produce, the handshakes, the scheduled conversations, the movement from room to room that a night like that requires, reasserted themselves, and the exchange closed in the way that unscheduled exchanges close, not with a formal conclusion, but with the natural dissolution of the space the conversation had briefly created. What Katt Williams carried forward from those 5 minutes is not something that can be pointed to in any single moment of his subsequent career, isolated and identified as the thing that came from the conversation that night. The influence of an exchange like that one does not work that way. It doesn't produce a specific new technique or a new bit or a new structural approach to the form. What it produces is a recalibration of the internal standard, the standard by which a performer evaluates their own work in real time, in the room, when the room is giving back information about what is landing and what is not. What the people who were in the rooms where Katt Williams performed in the years following that evening have described, in the particular way that audiences describe performances that struck them as different from other performances they've seen, is a quality of presence that is difficult to name, but unmistakable to be in the presence of. Not presence in the superficial sense of stage charisma, though the charisma was there. Presence in the deeper sense, the quality of a performer who is discovering the set as it happens, even when the set has been performed many times, because the discovery is real in the specific sense that Eddie Murphy had named that night. Real in the sense that what the room gives back on this particular night with these particular people is genuinely new information that the performance is incorporating in real time. 5 minutes at an industry event in the mid-2000s, an exchange that left no formal record, no transcript, no documentation beyond the memories of the few people adjacent to it and the thing it produced in the person who stood there and listened. But in every room where that recalibration showed itself in the years that followed, the 5 minutes were there, in the particular quality of a set that felt discovered rather than executed. In the room that went somewhere because the performer was genuinely in it. Eddie Murphy gave Katt Williams 5 minutes. Katt Williams used them for the rest of his career.